Again, my name is Charles Faulhaber. I'm the director of the Bancroft Library, and I'm very pleased to welcome you here this morning. We owe the use of this room to the English department, and they have asked us not to have any food or drink in here. This will become operative during the break because, in fact, we do have coffee and rolls and things that we'll be setting up outside. We are selling the catalog of our exhibition celebrating Mexico in the back of the room, $20, including tax. I hope you do that. I was very remiss yesterday because I did not introduce the two people who were responsible for the putting on the exhibition and working on the catalog. Jack Van Ooy is here. He's our pictorial curator. Put your hand up, Jack. And Teresa Salazar, the curator of the Western Americana and Latin Americana collections, is not here, but between the two of them, they've done a marvelous job. Later, we will be circulating. I think most of you put your names down on our list for announcements about Bancroft stuff, so we will be circulating that during the course of the day. So. I have mixed emotions right now. You are going to hear our keynote speech, Genealogy of Rebellion, Politics of Revolution, by Adolfo Gilly, who is Professor Emeritus at UNAM, one of the most respected historians in Mexico because of the academic rigor, not only of his academic rigor, but also his firm and open advocacy for indigenous rights and the democratization of Mexico's institutional life. His first book on the Mexican Revolution opened new ways to understand this movement in an international context, and his numerous books, by my count 25, are required reading for anyone wishing to understand Mexico and Central America, because he's also worked on Nicaragua and Guatemala in the 20th century. But you're not going to hear Professor Gilly himself because of causas ajenas a su voluntad. He was not able to be with us today. But since he was going to be reading the paper in English, he did send it to us about 10 days ago in Spanish. We had it translated, a wonderful translation by Luis Ramos, a young graduate student in comparative literature. And I sent that back to Professor Gilly a couple of days ago. He read it over, gave it his visto bueno, made a few minor corrections. So I am standing in for him. The paper, these are his words, but obviously not his voice. And I will just begin. The title is Le Temps des Séries, Genealogy, Rebellion, Politics of Revolution. For over a century, Mexican history was a history of peasant riots and rebellions framed by two revolutions, the War of Independence in 1810 and the Mexican Revolution in 1910. Today, institutional Mexico celebrates its two revolutions and the political changes they brought about. This Mexico forgets, hides, or leaves in the shadows of the past those rebellions that foreshadowed and gave its revolutions their substance and destiny. In contrast to these two revolutions and their stated goals, these rebellions did not imagine institutions or policies. They merely sought justice. These two revolutions, separated by a century, were marked by clear differences. The War of Independence sought emancipation from the yoke of colonial rule at a moment in which the Napoleonic Wars opened a historical crisis in Spain and its vast American empire. The Mexican Revolution, at least initially, sought a democratic transformation of the country's political structure against the land-owning oligarchy, which had consolidated wealth and power by despoiling rural and agrarian communities of land and water, and by inserting Mexico into the Belle Epoque global economy. Both revolutions, each in relation to distinct historical conditions, changed the structure of the state and its political institutions. Yet both preserved intact the founding divide that has plagued Mexico since Spanish conquest. That is, the racial divide that the Republic has forever failed to recognize in its laws, but not in its practices. On one side of this divide, the underdogs organized and launched rebellions, without which no revolution would be possible. On the other side of this divide, those on top forged the alliances, projects, and conspiracies that led to ruptures in the political order, which then transformed the rebellions into revolutions. In this way, Mexico experienced in one century, between 1810 and 1910, 2 revolutions. Yet after the first one, there were countless indigenous rebellions, large and small, all of them seeking the same demands that the Republic had repeatedly denied: land, justice, rights, and liberty. All of these rebellions shared an age-old immaterial demand, the end of humiliation, dignity and respect for each and all as the essence of human relations. In its substance, the revolution of the War of Independence of 1810 would be better understood as a broad rebellion of the Indian peoples and communities in defense of their communal rights, their way of life, and their own worldviews, which the Bourbon reforms of the colonial era had denied them since the second half of the 18th century. Eric Van Young, John Tutino, William Taylor, and many other historians have uncovered in historical archives the reasons, motives, and methods of the peasant insurrections. In The Labyrinth of Solitude, published in 1950, Octavio Paz describes this phenomenon as follows: "The War of Independence was a war of classes, and its character will not be fully understood if we do not recognize that, in contrast to its South American counterparts, it was an agrarian revolution in the making." The resulting change in the country's political structure, the emergence of an independent republic, placed power in the hands of the new dominant Creole elite, landowning, lettered, white. But little or nothing changed in the content or forms of domination against which the Indian and peasant communities had rebelled. Little or nothing changed for the Indians in the substance of humiliation as the defining feature of the racial domination exercised by old and new masters. Here, rebellion and revolution took divergent paths, contents, and meanings. As a result, that, quote, class war, that agrarian revolution in the making, unquote, was prolonged throughout the 19th century in the continued resistance, both open and clandestine, of indigenous communities who fought to defend their communal lands, their way of life, and their very lives from the plunder and racial oppression they faced under Republican rule. An intermittent and dispersed indigenous war with neither center nor periphery grew and sharpened toward the end of the 19th century, and in 1910, this war erupted into a new agrarian revolution, what is known as the Mexican Revolution. This revolution of 1910, so different in its beginnings and its stated aims from the War of Independence, underwent a similar dichotomy. This time, however, the dichotomy presented itself clearly and acutely, incarnated in the various projects and armies within the revolution itself. One part was the rebellion of the peasant communities of both the North and South, transformed into popular revolution in the armies of Emiliano Zapata and Pancho Villa. Another was its ideological component, composed of the liberal political chiefs and leaders that culminated in the Constitution of 1917 and in the successive Mexican governments from 1920 on, after the armed peasants had been defeated and their radical demands had been appeased through agrarian reform and other legal means. The proclamations and political objectives of the ruling elites of both revolutions were just as different as the nations that they each envisioned. However, the actions and aims of the indigenous peasant uprisings, answering the call of these proclamations in each revolution, were surprisingly similar. A century later, the methods of resistance, its vocabulary, and its repertoire of confrontation, to use the language of other historians, repeated itself. Eric Van Young, in The Other Rebellion, describes the rebels' patterns of behavior during the War of Independence when they overtook a community. They would invariably throw merchandise into the streets or into the city squares so that townspeople could take it. They would keep money and cattle for themselves. They would free prisoners from jail and kidnap the town's Spaniards and white officials. Felipe Ávila, in Entre el Porfiriato y la Revolución, describes what occurred from the beginning of the revolution in 1911 in the Zapatista territories: armed confrontations, taking over of towns, sackings, burning of public offices and archives, forced loans, freeing of prisoners, and execution of the authorities, business people, employees of haciendas and factories, and foreign residents. This plebeian violence, as Avila calls it, was described by the press of the period as Indian violence. Although the term Indian came charged with racist connotations, the events revealed a greater truth. The Zapatista Revolution of 1911, in its agrarian origins, the composition of its troops and its leaders, as well as in its actions, was essentially an Indian rebellion, despite the proclamations and programs of its national leaders that the Mexican Revolution, begun in 1910, was a democratic political revolution. If in one century the various proclamations, programs, and aims of the leaders of the revolutions of 1810 and 1910 were so diverse, where does the strange repetition of gestures and actions by the protagonists of the two rebellions, the indigenous communities of Mexico, come from? In fact, the imaginations of the leaders of these revolutions were responding to a new politics that corresponded to shifting historical circumstances, a politics frequently identified with the term progress. By contrast, the plebeian violence of the others stemmed from a genealogy transmitted over the course of successive generations as experience and as an immaterial heritage comprised of feelings, ways of being, the collective imagination, customs, worldviews. The programs of the revolutionary elites pointed toward a future society and political structure. In contrast, the gestures, actions, and methods of resistance of the Indian communities were responses to the aggressions, humiliations, and dispossessions they and their ancestors had suffered in the past, nourished by those experiences both inherited and repeatedly manifested in their own lives. Rebellion arises from that past, and from it takes its motives and methods. We're going to have the football folks with us during the course of the morning. Rebellion arises from that past, and from it takes its motives and methods. It is at once inheritance and genealogy. The resulting revolution demolishes old institutions and establishes new ones in their places. It offers both a political program and a politics. The reasons for a rebellion are not necessarily antagonistic to the political objectives of the revolution. Nevertheless, they are certainly different. This difference was made evident in the Revolution of 1910, when the peasant forces found themselves facing the constitutionalist forces in battle. When a revolution erupts, the moment of rebellion eclipses it completely, fills it with meaning, and becomes confused with it as a result. Thus, the historian does not simply ask him or herself what happened, but rather, what was its meaning? These are moments which E.P. Thompson described in a classic passage about the kinds of questions the historian must ask about these unrecorded plebeian pasts. These, and I quote, "These questions, when we examine a customary culture, may often be concerned less with the processes and logic of change than with the recovery of past states of consciousness and the texturing of social and domestic relationships. They are concerned less with becoming than with being. As some of the leading actors of history recede from our attention, the politicians, the thinkers, the entrepreneurs, the generals, so an immense supporting cast, whom we had supposed to be mere attendants upon this process, press themselves forward. If we are concerned only with becoming, then there are whole periods in history in which an entire sex has been neglected by historians because women are rarely seen as prime agents in political, military, or even economic life. If we are concerned with being, then the exclusion of women would reduce history to fertility." Viewed from this perspective, the rebellion is the eruption of the dominated being into the political event of domination. To get a closer view of this event, the historian must observe and consider what bodies express with their actions before considering what words express. None of the two revolutions proclaimed that jails be opened, goods be divided, the archives of justice and property be burned, and enemies executed. Yet this is precisely what the rebels did in both cases. The task of the historian is not so much to judge such actions as good or bad, but rather to document that this is how it was. To reveal these events in history is not merely a matter of registering ideas of knowledge pertaining to a given time and place, but also to investigate and recover the modes of doing and being. Those ideas are certainly necessary in order to organize the objectives of a revolution, but the forms, the human bonds, and the imaginations by which that organization takes shape come from a deeper, more remote source. They dwell in the memory of the rebels, in their lived and inherited experiences, in that long, interlocking narration transmitted at home and in workplaces from one generation to the next. Here we are in the realm of a particular kind of history, a history of places and regions, and of the human beings who live, work, enjoy, and give meaning to their lives there. This is the meaning that E.P. Thompson had in mind when he suggested that those obscure and unacknowledged, but very real protagonists of these histories were preoccupied less with becoming than with being. This is the subtle line that, even as they form part of the same historical process, distinguishes a rebellion from a revolution. A rebellion is a rupture in the homogeneous time of history, says Walter Benjamin. This rupture is nourished by the image of the oppressed ancestors, not by a vision of the liberated descendants. Political programs propose a future that will be inaugurated by the coming into being of the revolution. But the strength of the rebellion, without which no revolution can exist, is derived from the accumulation of humiliations, dispossessions, and injustices over successive generations. Forse una rabbia antica, generazione senza nome, gli urlarono vendetta, runs a song, I won't translate that, runs a song by the Italian Francesco Guccini in order to explain the sense of the gesture without apparent meaning of a railroad engineer who in Bologna at the beginning of the 20th century rammed his locomotive against a luxury train coming the other way. Theaters and stadiums full of young men and women sang those lines in the Italy of the 1970s. Rebellion does not speak of the future. It speaks about the eradication of past injustices. Its exasperated violence, apparently devoid of meaning, and even at times against its own interests, comes from a source other than an imagined future. It stems from an interminable chain of humiliations and dispossessions endured by a community of victims and by their parents and grandparents. A revolution may culminate in the Declaration of the Rights of Man or in Olympe de Gouges' proclamation, but the rebellion that ignites it begins to gain momentum in the spirits from which the Cahiers de Doléances emerge. A rebellion wishes to detain, or at least interrupt, the time of humiliation and of contempt. In his theses on the philosophy of history, Walter Benjamin provides an image of this rupture and a curious anecdote about the July Revolution of 1830 in Paris. On the first evening of fighting, it so happened that the clocks in towers were being fired on simultaneously and independently from several places. An eyewitness, who may have owned his insight to the rhyme, wrote as follows: "Who would have believed it, it is said, that incensed at the hour, latter-day Joshuas at the foot of every clock tower were firing on clock faces to make the day stand still." This rupture in the homogeneous time of state-sanctioned domination and accepted obedience may or may not result in a revolution, a change in laws, in institutions, property ownership, in the forms and content of domination itself. This has certainly been the case in all successful revolutions: French, Haitian, Russian, Chinese, Vietnamese, Cuban, Bolivian, and in the two Mexican revolutions. These changes are made possible largely by prior social changes and are reflected in the programs, critiques, and activities of political elites. Yet it is not these elites, even the radical ones, who give shape to the rupture of the old order and open the path toward a new one. The protagonists of the material and bodily act of rebellion, without which there is no revolution, but at the most a change in the established political leadership, are others, those who have been repeatedly humiliated and abused. It is those for whom life has become intolerable, and for whom the rupture between elites, those of the old regime and the revolutionary ones, opens a new space to move onto center stage. It is perhaps in that spatial dichotomy between protagonists and supporting characters that the secret of what Benjamin called a fundamental aporia resides. I quote, "The history of the oppressed is discontinuous. The task of history consists of seizing the tradition of the oppressed. The continuum of history is that of the oppressors, whereas the representation of this continuum produces a leveling. That of the discontinuous lies at the base of any authentic tradition. The consciousness of this historic discontinuity is the proper history of the revolutionary classes in the moment of their action." Leo Trotsky, one of the leaders of the Russian Revolution, wrote his history of the Russian Revolution while he was in exile in Mexico from 1929 onward, the work of a writer, protagonist, historian, and chronicler of events. In the prologue to this work, he offered his own vision about the preservation of traditions from the past in the genesis of revolutionary ruptures, and about the relation between the rebellion of the people and the politics of their leaders. Quote, "The masses do not go to a revolution with a preconceived plan for a new society, but with the clear realization that it is impossible to continue to tolerate the old society. Only the leaders of their class have a political program, a program that still needs to be put to the test of events and the approval of the masses. It is only by studying the political processes of the masses themselves that we can reach an understanding of the role of political parties and caudillos, a role which in no way we wish to deny. They are an element, without being an independent one, that is very important for this process. Without a leadership organization, the energy of the masses would dissipate, like steam not contained in a boiler. But be that as it may, what drives the revolutionary movement is not the boiler nor the piston, but the steam." His suggestion for explaining the process is, therefore, to follow first the doing or actions, hacer, of the rebels, and only afterwards the words, decir, of its leadership. This dividing line between hacer and decir is also the one that separates rebellion and revolution. Even though they appear confused in reality, as we said, there is no revolution without rebellion, in the task of the historian, it is fundamental to recognize this division. Not a few histories of the Mexican Revolution are, above all, histories of the politics of its leaders, including its most radical ones, rather than an examination of the underlying motives for rebellion of the oppressed or their feelings, the processes in their consciousness that prompted them to risk everything in a rebellion. This is the tendency today among official commemorations of the two Mexican revolutions. In them speaks the voice and the memory of the institutions of the state. In other words, the voice of the order that emerged from the revolutions, and not the multiplicity of voices of the rupture of the preceding order that was the essence of each one of these rebellions. They are stories of history's continuum, as Benjamin would put it, and not of the historical discontinuity embodied in every revolution. In this way, the state's commemoration of the two Mexican revolutions is transformed into a discourse of power and its institutions, as if the task and the aims of the numerous rebellions had been to establish that power, rather than to destroy the powers that had been. In those discourses, continuity occupies the space of discontinuity and permanence displaces the impermanence, which is the essence of each rebellion. Mais il est bien court le temps des cerises. No one can ignore the changes in the economy, the modifications in the norms and forms of domination, or the crises and ruptures in the elites that can be found in the origin of every rebellion. But it is one's task to study its causes, and another to examine the forms it takes, of what occurs in the heart of the rebellion, of those modes of doing and of rebellion that repeat and renew themselves over time. A rebellion, a strike, an occupation of physical or symbolic places is a way of being together and among equals, free of outside dominance. It offers a means of establishing new forms of solidarity beyond the bonds of family ties and beyond the ties of the market, including wage labor. The bonds of rebellion stem from the past and have been established in shared workspaces, plantation, ship, mine, industry, studio, or in everyday life, village, town, neighborhood, city. They carry within them a certain pride of places that are ours. That is, the pride in places that we, the ones who are now rebelling, made with our labor and our life. These are places where in the past a sense of community and kinship, common to all rebellions, was created. It is in these kinds of places that the old slogan of the industrial workers of the world was first coined: an injury to one is an injury to all. That sense of community, belonging to subaltern history, has its sacred sites and its symbolic spaces. This pride of place is often transmitted from generation to generation, even though it may not be recorded in history books. It is transmitted through narration, songs, and from the old to the young, even as they are adapted to new circumstances. Yet, in a factory, in a working neighborhood, in a farm worker's village, in an indigenous community, the transmission of stories of time outside of time persist and renew themselves as organizers of feelings. These kinds of narrations and their auras will nourish future rebellions or protests or challenges to power, even when their motives and reasons might be as different as the new times. These narrations nevertheless have something in common. They will remember, repeat, and recreate those moments of discontinuity in which the continuity of imposed humiliation is ruptured, and especially when this imposition affirms itself along the line of racial distinction. Instead of first documenting the economic changes that so many histories emphasize, these stories and myths of past rebellions remember and celebrate, above all, those moments and places that disrupt an order based on humiliation and on a world turned upside down. These are the mythical moments of the rebellion. Through victory, revolutions seek to perpetuate these moments. But the moments tend to dissolve, even if they do not entirely disappear, in the new order which the revolution necessarily establishes. If this order freezes into a purely despotic or authoritarian regime, as was often the case in revolutions of the past century, those stories and myths return to their subaltern places and manifest themselves in new and unprecedented ways. This distinction between revolution and rebellion, even when both events appear as confused or indistinguishable, is a task of the highest priority for the historian. Indeed, a revolution is not simply what may be said in books or what programs its leaders propose, but above all, what the people who rebel do. The genealogy of this doing or action, hacer, should be a central one for the scholar concerned with revolutions and rebellions, and with their political programs, their actions, and their imaginations. In his last manuscript, Theses on the Philosophy of History, Walter Benjamin wrote, "The class struggle, which is always present to a historian influenced by Marx, is a fight for the crude and material things without which no refined and spiritual things could exist. Nevertheless, it is not in the form of the spoils which fall to the victor that the latter make their presence felt in the class struggle. They manifest themselves in the struggle as courage, humor, cunning, and fortitude. They have retroactive force and will constantly call in question every victory past and present, of the rulers. As flowers turn toward the sun by dint of a secret heliotropism, the past strives to turn toward that sun which is rising in the sky of history. A historical materialist must be aware of this most inconspicuous of all transformation. It will be an historiadora of a revolution who will know how to recognize in its interior the rebellion without confusing them as one, and yet without separating them into two. Ha dicho. Thank you. It obviously makes no sense for me to try to answer any questions, but I do think that there is a lot of food here for discussion, especially for the professional historians among you. So I will simply leave it open for the discussion. We'll be circulating microphones. Yeah, just hold on a second. Jamie?
I'd like to ask the historians present, and particularly from Mexico, what their thoughts are on the 2006 elections and the loss, maybe perhaps not formal, in a democratic attempt for López Obrador and the movement, the people's movement, that he seemed to represent a multifaceted people's movement in this progress or non-progress of Mexico from 1810 to 1910 to the present. I sometimes wonder if that might have been a moment where the revolution might have been carried forward, and I'd like to hear your views as professional historians.
Don't everybody speak at once. Let me ask a question. Go ahead, John.
I liked Trotsky's idea of the masses provide the steam. Now, but compared to the U.S., I have this vision that the elites take advantage of the steam, and in Mexico, as compared to here, we were able to outrun the elites. We immigrated west. We essentially ignored government. We just raced away from the East Coast. But it seems to me that in Mexico, they didn't have that chance to outflank the elites, to outflank the government. Is that too naive a perspective of the whole thing?
Barry?
This is just a comment, really, more than I think we're probably going to have sort of comments in sequence rather than necessarily a dialogue at the moment. It's kind of difficult to have a dialogue without the actual speaker there being there to kind of respond. But just responding to the interesting presentation that you just read out, Adolfo Gilly's history. I mean, one of the most interesting things about that presentation, of course, is the discussion of the relationship, very complex relationship between rebellion and revolution, since we conventionally see those as being two quite separate categories. I mean, there's a long, long history of studies in Mexico of rebellion, particularly in the colonial period. And as I hear Adolfo's words in your presentation today, I'm of course immediately reminded of the very sensitive work done on colonial rebellions, particularly peasant rebellions, by Bill Taylor, of course, trying to bring back the story to Berkeley whenever one can. And it sort of reminded me, I think, of the fact that the discussion of the sort of texture, the everyday texture, the everydayness, the quotidian experience of rebellion that Adolfo is suggesting that we need to pay our attention to in the 20th century, that this seems to have been done rather more elaborately and consistently by historians of colonial Mexico rather than by historians of the 20th century, which I think is a challenge for those of us who are 20th century historians. So it's the Eric Van Youngs and the Bill Taylors and their Mexican colleagues who've been doing that most most successfully. The Zapatista movement, I mean, the original Zapatista movement certainly has generated some of this kind of scholarship. But I think we're still, and maybe there's some work on looking at this everyday texture in the case of the Cristero movement of the second half of the 1920s. But it's a dimension that I think we need to pay a lot more attention to in the future. So that's really a kind of editorial comment rather than anything else.
Anyone care to comment about, looking at Chiapas? How does this fit in? And were there similar, after the Cristeros, before Chiapas, were there similar kinds of things going on in the indigenous communities in Mexico during the, let's say the, roughly the period, the middle of the 20th century? Speaking as a medievalist, not as so, from a position of ignorance, in other words.
I think that I thought that that Adolfo's paper was really remarkable. I mean, one of the most interesting things of his that I've heard. And there's one side of it though that I have some trouble with and might connect with some of the things that are being raised here, and that is that very sharp distinction between doing and saying. Saying, as people who work on language have shown, it can be and is in some ways a type of action, form of doing, doesn't necessarily have the status that it's popularly attributed, that is popularly attributed to it, which is that it is a facade only or rationalization of some other form of action that is truer. So I think that what Adolfo's call for doing, for the analysis of doing, is something that one should take very much to heart, I think. But I would include in that doing a close analysis of speech, of saying, as part of what is being done. And if we do that, then it seems to me that the questions like some of the ones that have been raised, like yours or the one on 2006, come into focus in a somewhat different way, because the other problematic point for me in Adolfo's paper was his desire. It sounded to me like his desire. I'm really sad he's not here to confirm or reject this. What sounded to me like a desire to, let's say, indigenize the Zapatismo, the original Zapata rebellion. That's how I heard it. That is, the sense that the Zapatista rebellion was sort of, malgré tout, an Indian rebellion. Well, this problem has to do with our own desire to give some kind of mythical direction to history, a desire that is manifested in this conference in the very title, that is, Mexico's unfinished revolutions. I don't know what a finished revolution is, right? No one knows what a finished revolution is. So there's a kind of, let's say, horizon, utopian horizon that is present in the title, which brings forth these kinds of questions like, does Zapatismo fit into the cycle? Does 2006 fit into the cycle? Well, you can only begin to have that argument if you seriously consider speech as part of the argument, because if you don't, and you look at only at actions, then what you have is the structure of rupture that Adolfo, I thought that was the best part of the paper, brilliantly described. That is that moment of revolution, which is the revolt against the order of oppression and not the creation of a new order. So to me, the response to these kinds of questions, that is does Zapatismo fit in, or is 2006, would 2006 have, quote, finished the revolution or not, as a historian or as an anthropologist that I am, calls really to an analysis of the speech of the people who are making that kind of argument, because 2006 can be analyzed in many different ways. One of them, and it is a way that many of the actors proposed, was in connection to this long history of revolutions. The Chiapas thing was obsessed, let's say, with placing itself within that view of history. But that's not the only way in which one might tell it. And if one takes Adolfo's position, then I think one could undermine that story very well and say, well, in fact, the Chiapas thing may not be part of the same story, or the 2006 may not be, because if you leave the words out of it, then who knows what would emerge.
Emilio?
Can I just add to that? I mean, on the other side of that equation, the question of sort of the interpretation of actions, right? I mean, it's no different, right, in the end, because they're mediated by our sources. So when Adolfo says, well, pay less attention to what they say and more to what they do, we know that they go and they throw things in the middle of the plaza, but how do we know that? I mean, this is too bad, because Adolfo, if he were here, we would have a very interesting discussion about that. You know, how do we know that they did that? Well, you know, if it happened in 1810, we know it through some source, and then you get into the same kinds of problems, essentially of interpretation that you would have with the rhetorical, I think, part of it. I mean, I thought it was a fascinating lecture. I find myself in agreement in a lot of things and disagreement with others, and once again, it's not really fair. I mean, I would say that one thing, though, that I think that underlying his argument, and this is something for debate, there are certain assumptions about sort of the unifying qualities of these popular movements, and therefore, in some sense, about the unifying values of these popular actors that ought to be debated over a long period of time. So one could say 1810, 1910, 2010, or 1994, that Adolfo doesn't really engage in. That is, in some sense, his argument is predicated on the assumption, once again, that if in 1810 they threw things out into the middle of the plaza and, you know, slaughtered the Spaniards, and in 1910 in Morelos they did the same, there's some kind of, I think the way he put it, sort of self-evident continuity there, which I would think we ought to debate. And now I know this is really part of a bigger debate among historians. I mean, on the question, for example, you know, of the relationship between the Chiapas rebellion and the regional Zapatismo. I mean, it's a longer kind of discussion, and I think we fall on different sides of this. And perhaps, I mean, I know that you want to say something. Perhaps there's another point of view there to be expressed. But, you know, I too felt that in some ways that distinction, it's a difficult one for historians to sustain. I mean, how do we know what it meant for them to throw out things in the middle of the plaza? You know, I mean, after all, I wasn't there. I didn't see it. Even that would have been problematic. I have a document that from someone as a witness who says that they did this. I mean, so once again, I mean, this is a very basic methodological question, but I think it dissolves that kind of distinction in a way that ought to make us think about it a little more.
His comments about the Indian nature of the Zapatista Revolt speaks directly to your paper yesterday as well. I mean, the question is, who is an Indian? And Erika.
Just to add to that, I think that one of the things that is interesting about the way, to use the difficult label, political culture, just the way in which in the 20th century, Mexican social movements used history constantly. You know? The 1994 and the whole discourse, which was adopted even by the Mexican military, of the problem here is the latifundio, when in the Altos de Chiapas, the problem was not the latifundio. I think adds another wrinkle to this. This idea that the fight has been for justice in 1810 and 1910 and 1994 and 2006, and that we're talking about this long struggle of this long-suffering nation. And I think that that's one of the things that, as historians, we need to take into account and be very suspicious of, well, this is the same truncated revolution.
I think in terms of the notion of the Zapatistas as Indians or indigenous people, my anthropologist friend Samuel Villela, who has worked a lot of that in photography, certainly he made a distinction one day when we were talking between the Zapatistas of Morelos and the Zapatistas of Guerrero. And his position was that the Zapatistas of Morelos were campesinos, whereas the Zapatistas of Guerrero were indigenous. And one of the ways maybe we can see that is in the use of bows and arrows. You see bows and arrows in images of Zapatistas in Guerrero. I have never seen any in Zapatistas of Morelos. You also see bows and arrows in images of Mayo and Yaqui Indians in the north. So, you know, we've been talking a lot about how do we know who's in it, you know, how do we distinguish between Indians and campesinos? And it strikes me that that might offer us at least one visual lead.
In the back?
A lot of the distinctions commonly made between indigenous people and campesinos are arbitrary for the simple fact that a lot of the campesinos have internalized a lot of the norms established by the hierarchy of power. So there's this huge de-Indianization process that occurs and has occurred in Mexico. So let's say, for example, the state of Michoacan, where I'm from, I'm a Purépecha indigenous. Yet in the Purépecha community, if a Purépecha community has less than half of the people speaking Purépecha, they will no longer be recognized as a Purépecha community. So these are arbitrary notions placed by a outside force. These are not emic perspectives, these are etic perspectives, but after hundreds of years, they become internalized. So it's a game of semantics and words where people are trying to arbitrarily erase indigenous populations and state that one group is now a farm worker and no longer an indigenous person. It's just very problematic considering Mexico's history and the contemporary state of affairs. Thank you.
Claudio?
Very briefly on this question. I did the first work that I did was in Postland, which was a Nahuatl-speaking place, mostly bilingual by the time of the revolution. And if you look at documents of Maximiliano's time, that is in the 1860s, political leaders of Tepoztlán went to see Maximiliano and presented themselves as indigenous, because Maximiliano was kind of indigenista. By the time of the revolution, however, the people of Tepoztlán, by and large, did not identify themselves as Indians. For instance, I, in the 70s, interviewed people who still, had still been alive at the time, and they would say with a certain disgust, that is, nos decían, for example, on the hacienda, they said, nos decían indios tepostecos, right? What he's acknowledging is the use of the term indio as a discriminatory category, that they did not, he himself, this person who I'm thinking, did not affiliate himself to. So what I think is a little bit problematic in that moment in Adolfo's paper, is the desire to stabilize the subject of revolution. That is to say, the subject of revolution is indigenous, or the subject of revolution is not indigenous, is peasant or whatever. I think as it's worth, certainly as a historian, paying attention to the categories that are being used by the people themselves. In that sense, I agree with the most recent intervention. That is, an emic perspective, as you put it, is really important. And I think that if you take an emic perspective, you'll find that the way in which people identify shifts.
To the right. Yeah, we do, because we're recording this.
I'm just very interested in some of the, what I think are very kind of important gestures that Adolfo Gilly is making to what's might be, I mean, I'm not a historian, so I'm not part of the field. I'm looking at this completely from outside, but there seems to be a subterranean dialogue there with the kind of history that came out, not so much from Mexican history, but far more from the South Asian, sorry? Subaltern studies, no? And so there's a complete kind of conversation there with that way of doing and making history. And I think that the question about that he raises with Benjamin is not so much about the ways in which these revolutions or rebellions are racialized, but in terms of the time of rebellion versus the time of revolution. There's a real kind of concern there for the question of the temporalization of the doing and saying, in which one does not and will never fit in completely with the other. And so I think that what's fascinating to me is the way in which this history of commemoration is being opened up to a history or a historicization built on disjuncture and on not so much the homogeneous time of capital, but the heterogeneous claims of the disgruntled masses in the face of domination. So for me, it's a question of temporality more than race.
One more comment. No, not John, not you. There's a woman here in front with a red pen.
Thank you. I'm also an anthropologist, a Mexican anthropologist, and following on what has been said about the indigenous character of the revolutions, or the peasant or campesino character of the revolution, and the saying and doing, I'm going to connect several things, because also this comment that was raised next to me about if here in the United States you kind of went away from the leaders and the way of thinking that was, set forward. I think all of them apply. I also had the chance to work with Maya, native monolingual Mayan in Mexico. And I could say, for example, that for them, the revolution passed by. It didn't exist almost in the Mayan, in the Op Yucatan. And also, even being monolingual Mayas that didn't even speak Spanish and that wanted to learn English because the labor was in Cancun and they knew they need English to mingle with the Americans. Even then, they didn't consider themselves Indians in the same way. When I talk to them, I ask them, well, you're an Indian Maya, or you're a Maya, and the answer was, no, I speak La Maya, but I'm not an Indian. Indians were, they are the past ones. They are our ancestors. They were those that really knew. I don't. I just live here. I'm not an Indian. And when I tried to talk to them, to reivindications, these were peasants, self-sufficient peasants. It was before the Zapatista Chiapas revolution. This was at the beginning of the 90s. They never had this thought even about the Mexican Revolution as having fight for land, and the land is for those that work in it. I mean, literally no connection to that reality, despite the fact that they were Mexicans, they had grown in Mexico. They were taught in the school system of the national education system with the history lessons in Mexico. And actually, that was the work that I was doing. It was about education. And in relation to that, it also makes me think about, well, the intellectual, the paradigm, if you want it, in the fight, which I also would make a distinction between having the intellectual paradigm between the revolution not having it, the rebellion not having it, and the revolution having it much more elaborated. And I think that, I don't know if Mexicans were able or not to escape from the leader's discourse. I think that most of the Mexicans that were fighting in the original Zapatista movement in Morelos were fighting very much for what was shown in the film. They were fighting, those men from Morelos, where I had lived as well, they were fighting for land, for the land. No much discourse, no much elaboration probably made there. And then it was a whole other strata of the society that elaborate the discourse, that put the words, and also that goes the semantic. Basically, I don't think that any Mexican right now, well, not any Mexican, I cannot say that, but very few Mexicans can assume themselves as being Indians before being campesinos. I think it's different moments of identity and self-identity in which they proclaim one or the other. And that happens with most of the Mexicans. We are Mexicans, but we can be Jewish from all sorts of origins, ethnic, religious, social group, indigenous groups. And the self-identity and the identity that is given to us by others is a very rhetoric and triple-folded issue in Mexico. So it was just a comment linking others.
Let's call a halt. We do have coffee and juice and so on and so forth outside. Again, I ask you to not bring anything back in here. We will reassemble at 10:30.